Hi, and welcome to See This Building. There used to be shows here. Now that I've completed 6 stories here at See This Building, I wanted to go through some of your comments and stories you've added and expand a bit on some other topics as well. We'll start with the Bernard Pub story. Kurt Hoffman added, I saw Fugazi, and my favorite show was The Adolescents. Kids of the Black Hole was my favorite song. Rick Agnew was at the bar after the show. I asked him if he'd write the lyrics down on the back of the flyer, which he did, and I still have it. I know this is a total cliche, but it is true. This is a great example of how very connected the bands and the fans were in punk rock, and hopefully still are. Derek Bean added, a group called Not Just Me also booked a bunch of shows there, which originally included Kathy and Roberta from Breakfast Beverages. Our first show was Toxic Reasons and Generation Waste. That was December 1987. I do recall seeing Not Just Me. I don't know that I knew that Kathy and Roberta were part of that as well. It's cool that you did Toxic Reasons. So many bands that were considered big back then were often dealing with the 15-year-old high school kids as promoters. I don't know if that is a common thing nowadays, or if it would even be possible. I would guess beyond really small basement shows, that probably isn't the case anymore. And then Mike Doskasil added that he did play drums at that first show with Animation, as well as Put It On. He said he believes Brett Rosenberg first told them about it, and that a guy, Bill Bernard, wanted to put on new wave shows. He probably wanted to put on any show since the place was closed more nights than it was open back then. So we Xeroxed some flyers, spread them around where the Fun 100 would most likely see them, and the gig was on. Another thing he added is, it was in the paddy wagon on the way to jail at the Offenders, April '84, that the first lineup of Drunks with Guns got the bright idea to start a band. And the Wild Stairs stayed at my apartment on Oakland after the Bernard show. I still have the signed 12-inch EP they left me, as I was way too hungover to make them breakfast before they left the next morning. What an incredible band they were. Of all the things I could discover from doing these stories, the fact that Drunks with Guns was formed in the paddy wagon after the Offender show is probably the coolest thing I've heard so far. I don't know that I ever knew that. Chuck Havens added, somehow we got Life Sentence to play our high school in Edwardsville. The school was not happy, and yes, I ended up getting arrested. I don't know how I went all of this time without ever knowing that Life Sentence played a show at a high school in Edwardsville, Illinois. That seems like something I should have remembered if I ever knew it. Also from Mark Eberhardt, one time I saw DRI there and I couldn't find anyone to go with, so I had a friend drop me off because I thought I'd know someone there. Turns out I didn't know anyone. Afterwards, was worried about trying to walk back home. I was going to SLU at the time, through the neighborhood, scrawny white kid with a mohawk. So I stood outside the door and asked everyone who came out for a ride. Some people from Belleville gave me a lift. Subsequently, so many of my good friends in the scene are from Illinois, but it wasn't any of them. To this day, I still don't know. This is another great example of the many things that went on that I could never have known about. In punk rock, it wasn't just the shows themselves, but the experience of getting there and getting home, and all of the people that you met along the way. Moving on to the Lindle Club. One comment that I wanted to make note of here from John Green. Those were Bob Woolsey shows. He did more than those two there. Some maybe more new wave, but mainly shows that Mississippi Nights didn't want to do. I liked the Lindle Club earlier when there was jazz or R&B. There was an unusual kind of displaced gaslight square types in their 40s. There was a fire pit in the middle of the room that I mentioned in my story as well. Serious, hard-drinking cocktail people. Neat place. That's from John Green, which I gather is the actual John Green. I asked him on there if it was him. He never replied, though. That does make sense about B&D, with Bob being there. I remember there being a couple of red-shirted B&D guys at the Circle Jerk show. So, John, if you're out there, it would be cool if we could do some kind of an interview at some point about your time doing shows. Moving on to Turner's, Derek Bean again. My first ever punk show at a venue was that Raw Power Dayglow Abortion show. Glad my recollection of it matches up with yours. I've often wondered if I was remembering anything incorrectly about it. I was 15. That place was gritty and scary, but exhilarating at the same time. It was a place of legend. Prior to going, I had heard many stories of running street battles between the showgoers and the neighborhood locals, and legendary tales of running street battles between Slash and the Alton Skins. Everything about this venue and that era is still fascinating to me at 49 years old. At that time, being 21, 22 myself, it again is cool to hear the perspective of the really young kids that went to shows there. As I said earlier, I was never that adventurous, so hats off to you. I didn't make it to a show until I was 19. Moving on to Brothers Bar, Vicky from New Values added that Brothers was owned by a friend of Jim Agnew. John Green had nothing to do with it. And she added that she booked some of the shows and Jim booked some of the shows. Since that one, I did talk to Jim Agnew, but we haven't been able to arrange a time for me to get together with him to ask any more questions about it. I hope to get to do that soon. It's funny to me that John Green was so involved in so many other places that he somehow managed to work his way into my brain at Brothers, too. The only thing I can think of is that he may have done that Micronaut show, because I have a memory of him being there, so maybe he was just there, I don't know. Anyway, it was all Jim Agnew, and apparently a guy that owned the company he worked for at the time. What I also found out from Jim Agnew is that he has a copy of the Circle Jerks show that I mentioned at Turner's. Jim Utz said that he had actually seen a minute or so of it a few years ago. Jim was afraid to play it any longer because he was afraid the tape was going to break. Jim Agnew doesn't remember that, but he does know that he did have a copy of it on VHS. He said he would take a look for it. Hopefully he'll find that, and I can get it digitized and posted on the YouTube at some point in the future. Moving on to Sports Palace, Derek Bean again. He said that my favorite of the 1980s St. Louis venues. That summer of '87 had so many incredible shows, and leading into the Naked Ray Gun show in September and DOA, which I think was November, maybe October. I was 15, 16 that summer, and had been going to punk shows for about a year at that point. Made for a great summer. Going to shows with Jim Billicky and his orange Mustang II, listening to 7 Seconds, Descendants, and Social Distortion in his car over and over again all summer long. And then he also confirmed that the DOA, No Means No, definitely did happen. He was there. Apparently I was too. It was a little bit after the Naked Ray Gun show. Great show. Sports Palace was my favorite of all the 80s St. Louis venues. Again, these are the types of stories I like to see. I always like to hear other stories about those shows. Many times my perspective was totally from playing shows, and to hear stories about what was going on with the kids, since by then I was already, like I said, in my early 20s. It's also very cool. And thanks for clearing up the whole DOA No Means No memory. I'm glad I didn't imagine that. And Eric King says, my favorite memory from there was Tim Mize pulling me behind the stage. Tim Mize was a singer for Laughingstock. To show me Keith Morris throwing a temper tantrum at John Green for not having bottled water at the venue when it was clearly on the rider. We laughed because we had no idea where you would even buy bottled water anywhere close to there. This is a great one. At this point, I don't even think I knew that riders were a thing. And I don't think that Evian was a thing in the Midwest yet. I don't remember it till at least a couple, maybe 3 years later. You could definitely buy 1-gallon jugs of water, but that was all I knew about. And from Gabe Katz with the Sports Palace, says his favorite experience at the Sports Palace was getting overpaid by John Green, who gave us twice as much as our guarantee. That was for the Black Flag show that we almost didn't get to play, but did after some stupefying explanation about how it wasn't going to work because of the extra ear fatigue by Kira, Greg, and Chuck. I heard that Henry Rollins did like our 20-minute set. We also played at the Offenders de Kreutzen show and something else. I keep thinking Murphy's Law, but that might have been one of the other shows that I already mentioned. I'm guessing that was sarcasm about being overpaid by John Green. I can imagine not having to endure many of the local bands across the country as much as they toured was high on their priority list, but that also meant you probably missed a lot of great bands in all those towns. And yes, Murphy's Law was the same night as de Kreutzen and Offenders. From Brent Jones, me and Nick Sakes went to the Naked Ray Gun show, and the singer was getting all pissy about people getting on the stage. I remember one of the opening bands was some metal band screaming about something about Mars, God of War. We went to Zantigos or Noggles or whatever it was called at the time after the show and couldn't stop yelling Mars, God of War at everyone. Something I did leave out from the Sports Palace Black Flag deal and my getting arrested going to buy a ticket to that show. As I was being driven to the police station by the cop, he was super angry and yelling at me, saying he didn't want to see me ever set foot on asphalt in New City again. I can't remember if I said it or just thought it. Unfortunately, I probably said it. Uh, what are you, the sheriff of U City? You're throwing me out of town? It just sounded so absurd to me, because it was. This is a photo of me standing on a skateboard in front of Vintage Vinyl a day or so later, I guess just to prove a point. Okay, so moving on to reflections from a Bradley Rintoul, I guess that is. If that's the UK subs from 1984, it was. That was my first punk rock concert. Still had the ticket stub up until a couple of years ago. Got it signed by Captain Scarlet and possibly Charlie Harper. Good times. Yes, it was. And from Debbie Lore, I took Nikki from verbal abuse to the hospital at the Sam Hain gig at Reflections. Sam Hain headlined. Nikki's arm was hurting, so we stopped on the way to the hospital to buy liquor. He didn't have any money on him, so we used my 905 liquor credit card and bought whiskey. I made sure the hospital didn't charge me for his admission as he had no ID. I missed all of Sam Hain. So that for sure clears up, definitely, that how Nikki got to the hospital that night. But for me, really, the best takeaway of this comment is that there was such a thing as a 905 credit card. I don't know that kind of thing exists anymore. So thanks again to everyone that commented, either here on Facebook or on the YouTube. Either way, the next thing I'll work on is a collection of one-off venues into one story. Places just had one or two shows all together in one. Again, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification button. Thanks again.